Our next guest has been calling for downturns in the economy and in the socioeconomic environment in the U.S. and abroad for several decades. Maybe now is finally the time his predictions are coming into fruition. Scary times indeed coming up ahead, according to Doug Casey. He is the founder of theinternationalman.com and the author of several best-selling books, including Crisis Investing and then Crisis Investing in the 90s. Both of these themes we'll be discussing today with Doug. He is also the owner of his own podcast on YouTube, Doug Casey's Take. So check out his YouTube channel for his latest discussions on current affairs and the economy. Welcome back, Doug. Pleasure to have you on Kitco, as always.
Thanks, David. Likewise.
Doug, it struck me that you are, rather prescient in calling for crises. We'll be discussing. I mean that in the best of sense. I'm not saying you're a doomsayer, but I do want to mention the fact that you have been calling for a decline in several facets of American society, all of which we're kind of seeing unraveling as we speak today. We'll be discussing this in detail. On your website, Doug Casey's internationalman.com, where you list a bunch of your musings in blog formats, I've noticed that on the homepage is a rather pressing title or headline. It says, "The U.S. and the world are heading towards a serious crisis." Okay, so you're no stranger to the word crisis. You've written books on literally crises. So what's the crisis we're heading towards now?
Well, we can almost take our choice. We seem to be emerging from the other side of the COVID hysteria, which was just when it was peaking as a psychosis, actually, a mass psychosis. It was replaced by the war in the Ukraine, which could spin out of control. And of course, after that calms down, the Russians are going to win, incidentally. We can talk about that. I think the next thing on the runway is going to be back to global warming or climate change, they wish. So it's like one thing after another. You remember on Saturday Night Live when Gilda Radner, one of her characters, Rosanna, said, "It's one thing after another. It's always something." And that's pretty much the world we live in today. And I attribute that, and I attribute my long-term bearishness to the rise of the state. Governments, as institutions, have become much, much more powerful and important in the world. Over the last 100 years, they've gone from being a minor nuisance to dominating society itself. And that's the cause for my long-term bearishness. Mm-hmm. At the same time, many things have gotten better in the world, mainly due to two things. Most people act like squirrels in a good way, in that they tend to produce more than they consume and set aside the difference as savings, capital. And the second thing is technology has been compounding at the rate of Moore's Law. So these things have tended to balance against the wholesale destruction that governments have caused.
I want to touch on a number of things you just said. We'll circle back to the war in Ukraine and the investing implications. But just on your point about government control and the rise of the state, okay, well, a lot of people may agree with you, but consider this, Doug. Throughout the 20th century, and actually in the last 100 years, 150 years or so, we've seen a rise in fascism throughout the early part of the 20th century. But then after the Second World War, we've seen a rapid decline in the number of authoritarian states throughout the world. Whereas before, I don't remember the exact number, but there were a lot more before than we currently have. You can find notable examples, North Korea being one of them, and a few other states in the Middle East, if you want to label them theocracies or autocratic states and whatnot. But more or less, we've had a decline in authoritarianism throughout the world. Would you agree with that statement?
I'm not sure I do, David. Frankly, from many points of view, the 19th century was the peak of Western civilization. And I am, incidentally, a huge fan of Western civilization. In my opinion, it's the only civilization in world history that's worth anything. During the 19th century, which really ended in 1914 with the with the start of the First World War, freedom was everywhere in the world, quite frankly. Governments, as I said, were just a minor nuisance. Sound money was everywhere, was gold, or in some cases silver. There were very few regulations. It was an ideal time to live. Since then, states in 1914 took about 10% across the board of the GDP of the countries they dominated. Now we're talking 50, 60% in many cases. So no, I'm not that optimistic. And Steven Pinker wrote a book. What's the name of it? I forget. That said that the amount of violence in the world has been decreasing for centuries. Yeah, in some ways that's true. Except when we have episodes, outbreaks of violence, they're really big, like World War II, 60, 80 million people die. World War I was 3 times, 4 times the size of World War I, totally incomparable to anything that happened in the 19th century. So what's going to happen now? Well, that's pretty much up in the air, because I think we're also on the edge of something I call the Greater Depression. Well, we're not on the edge of it. We've embarked upon it, where the world, the standard of living of the average guy is going to decline seriously.
Okay. Decline how?
Well, I think you can see it in the United States, quite frankly. There was a time when Americans expected their real income to go up by 3, 4, 5% per year. And the economy was growing at that rate. But it's been stagnant, actually, since the early 70s. And actually, I think it's declining now. It's not as bad. It doesn't look as bad as it could be, mainly because of debt and the dominance of the US dollar. In other words, from the point of view of the US as a whole, our major export since about 1980 hasn't been Boeings or IBMs or wheat. It's been dollars, quite frankly. And the standard of living in the US has been artificially propped up because the rest of the world has accepted trillions and trillions of these phony dollars, it's fiat currency, and in return has shipped us Mercedes and Sonys and cocaine, all kinds of things in trade for paper money. That's coming to an end. And what's happened in the Ukraine recently has kind of been the catalyst, the turning point. Let's change that, where I think all over the world now, people are starting to realize the dollar is a hot potato and the US government is actually bankrupt. So I think we're headed on a really steep downward slope at this point.
Okay, I want to touch on, I want to come back to the decline in living standards. There's a number of other points that may suggest that you're right. We are experiencing a decline in living standards. So I'll come back to that. Let's talk about Ukraine now, since you brought it up. Okay, so you had said that Ukraine is a catalyst for a decline in the status of the US dollar. Well, can you expand on that and maybe give a prognosis as to how you think the world will end? You did mention earlier in the interview that you think Russia will win the war. So Russia, what's the end of the war going to look like, and what does that mean for the dollar?
Well, let's go back to the start of the war.
Okay.
The start of the war, actually 2014, when there was a US-backed coup in Kiev, and the thug that favored Russia was overturned for a thug that favors the US. And at the same time, Russia took back Crimea, which historically, for hundreds of years, since they stole it from the Turks, has been a Russian possession. Most people are unaware of the fact that Ukraine only became, Crimea only became Ukrainian in 1954 when Nikita Khrushchev passed it to them for internal political reasons after the death of Stalin. And at the same time, these two provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk, called the Donbass, split off from the Ukraine. So that's when the war really started, actually. It's just heated up recently because the US has been trying to push the Ukraine to join NATO, which is, first of all, violates the Americans' previous agreement with the Russians, and is really stupid. It would be very much as if the Soviet Union had tried to get Canada and Mexico to both join the Warsaw Pact before the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, in other words, I disapprove totally. It's criminal on the part of Putin to have invaded the Ukraine, but there was plenty of provocation for it on the part of the West.
You disapprove of his invasion. Okay, I think, again, a lot of people would agree with you there, but what other choices did he have? Assuming we understand his incentive, assuming we understand his objectives, what other avenues could he have taken besides a physical invasion of the country?
Well, it's a real problem because the West has been provoking Russia with everything from sanctions to trying to get Ukraine to join NATO, where it serves no useful purpose. I mean, Ukraine isn't even a real country. It wasn't a country at all, quite frankly, until Lenin created it when he created the Soviet Union back in the early 1920s.
Well, there's a difference in cultures between the Ukrainian and the Russian people, no? I mean,
right.
We have to
right. There's a different, yeah, and they're not really historically friendly, because you might recall that during the 1930s there was an episode called the Holodomor, which where Stalin was responsible for the deaths of about 4 million Ukrainian peasants by starvation, which is, of course, one of the reasons why the Ukraine was favorable in many ways to the Germans when they invaded Russia in 1941, because they hated the Stalin regime so much. So, look, Putin is not trying to conquer the Ukraine. He's trying to solve a problem in a less than optimal way. But you'll recall that what he has said is that should the Ukraine recognize Crimea as part of Russia, a reasonable request, and it should recognize the two breakaway republics called the Donbass. Those two should be recognized as independent regimes, of which there are a number: Transnistria, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh. Most Americans and Canadians are completely unaware of the fact that there are lots of countries in the world that aren't members of the UN, and we don't even know they exist.
Okay,
so if those two things happen, and Ukraine promises that it will not become a member of NATO, well, be like Finland perhaps, no problem, they'll withdraw.
So this is important because we have to speculate as to what's going to happen to not just Ukraine and Russia and the relationship, but the new world order, if you want to call it that, and how investors' strategies might shift in relation to this new world order. Let's go back to this Russian victory. Concretely speaking, Doug, what does this Russian victory look like? Is it going to be like, look, one could argue that they could make a military victory like the U.S. did in Vietnam, but scholars have argued for decades that the U.S. lost the war in Vietnam for a number of, socio-political reasons. No one denied the fact that the U.S. Air Force carpet bombed North Vietnam. That fine. I mean, the Russians have the ability to do that as well, but can they win the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people?
Well, they don't have to, frankly, because my understanding, and of course, I was surprised. I think it was a real strategic error on the part of Putin to launch this major invasion with mass destruction, which is apparently the case. Although we don't really know what's happening in the Ukraine. We've been denied the right to listen to Russian propaganda and hear what they say. And everything that we hear here in the West is conflicting and uncertain. And, it's long been said that in a war, the first casualty is the truth. So we don't really know what's winning there, what's going on there. But I'm sure that since the Ukrainian Air Force and Navy have ceased to exist, that the Russians will conquer the place. And what do I think is going to happen? I'll make a prediction. that the Donbass become two independent countries, probably the eastern Ukraine, where most of the Russians live. Donbass is 60, 70% Russian. The rest of it will become a rump state, and the rest of the Ukraine will, centering around Kiev, will be left alone. Kind of end of story. But unfortunately, the antagonism towards Russia has been heated up to such a white hot stage that this is going to have all kinds of consequences. I mean, it's going to be very bad for the US, among other things, because I suspect this is the start. This is going to signal the start of a major bear market in bonds, which have been going up for 40 years. So you can forget about low interest rates. I don't care what the Fed buys. They can keep interest rates down by buying bonds, yes. But at that point, inflation is going to go from its current 15% or more, real number, not the number that they promote, to 20%, 25%. And when that happens, the bond market collapses. And when the bond market collapses, there go pension funds, there go most mutual funds, there go, it's going to be, and the stock market goes with it. So we're in for really, really tough times.
Okay, let's talk about investing then. So I don't want to make it sound like it's war profiteering we're discussing. That's not at all the topic of our conversation. We're talking about ways investors should be positioned in preparation for potentially an escalation of this conflict or any future conflict down the line. Now consider this, Doug. Since the end of the Vietnam War in the late 70s, since the 80s, the early 80s, let's just keep it to the last 40 years, we've had only 4 major bear markets or market crashes, if you want to call it that. 1987, 2000, which was the tech bubble burst. Now 2008, the great financial crisis, and of course 2020, the onset of the COVID pandemic. Now, none of these scenarios that I've listed, the 4 bear markets, were caused by the onset of a war. You'll recall that the invasion of Iraq began in 2003, which was followed by the second longest bull market in American history. What I'm saying, Doug, is that if history repeats itself, does it not stand to reason that the stock markets could continue rallying despite a war? Maybe markets like war.
Okay, that's possible, even though war destroys real wealth. But the bull market that we've experienced for, well, couple decades now, is basically caused by the Fed printing money, printing trillions of dollars worth of currency units. And most of that has flowed into the stock market. That's why the rich have gotten richer in recent years at accelerating rates, while the poor have gotten poorer. That's going to accelerate too, because now finally, all this money printing, all this currency unit printing is started to filter down from the financial markets, which have good inflation, benefiting the rich, to retail inflation, gasoline prices, food prices, rent prices. So this is terra incognita we're in right now, where at this point, the US government is mainly financed by printing money. It used to be, remember, we'd borrow money from the nice Japanese and the nice Chinese, and they lent money to finance US government benefits, deficits. They don't do that. They're liquidating all their dollars. The only source of borrowing now available is the Federal Reserve.
Sure.
The US government sells its bonds to the Federal Reserve. The Fed credits its accounts at commercial banks with dollars. That's actually the engine of inflation. And we're going to see a lot more of it. So count on inflation going a lot higher and the standard of living going a lot lower in the years to come. One of the guarantees for that, incidentally, is the fact that Washington, D.C. Is now controlled by, well, I hate to say, actual Bolsheviks, actual Jacobins. Well, they're not Jacobins and Bolsheviks, but the people in Washington.
Figuratively, of course. I don't think they're actual Bolsheviks.
No, not actually. But I'll say this, they share the same philosophy, the same economic and political outlook as the French Jacobins and the Russian Bolsheviks. They really do. They believe in state control, much more government. And of course, as things get worse, the average American is going to say, do something, because the average American thinks that now that the government is the solution, not the problem, and they'll ask the government to do something. And of course, the government will do something. They love to do that. And it's almost always the wrong thing. So I'm really quite bearish. And in the markets, I'm in the futures markets, because I trade a lot of commodities, I'm generally short the S&P, short bonds, and I have been long gold and silver. So that's how I'm treating it as a general rule.
Let me pause this scenario. I'm just going to finish on geopolitics, and then we'll talk about commodities. Let me pause this scenario. Now, in the prior examples of war that I've listed since the early 80s, I don't think that we've had a major disruption in global trade. I mean, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan was more or less localized to the Middle East, for example. We haven't had a major armed conflict between two great powers. What if the U.S. gets into a firefight with China, let's say? People are now talking about Taiwan being the next Ukraine. Well, how likely is it that China will be emboldened by the U.S.'s or the West's lack of direct military action in Eastern Europe and see this as an opportunity to take action against Taiwan? And if they do, what will likely be the U.S. response?
Well, the U.S. has been engaged in a lot of sport wars for years. And, minor invasions. We invaded Panama. We invaded Grenada.
That's right.
We invaded Iraq. We invaded Afghanistan. These are sport wars, not serious. But what we're doing now is much, much more serious. It's going to result in the dollar being deplatformed as the world's reserve currency. In fact, the Nigerians have agreed to accept Chinese yuan. The Saudis are talking about accepting Chinese yuan. Nobody trusts the dollar. So I guess that leads us to, well, how's China fit into all this? Are they going to invade Taiwan? I'm betting against it. It would be too costly, too dangerous, too disruptive. And why should they do it? I mean, all Beijing has to do is just bide its time and wait.
Well, what is the strategic importance of Taiwan to the West? Why does America need to meddle in what the Chinese believe to be their own internal affairs? I mean, it's like saying if Rhode Island wants to succeed and China comes along and says, no, we support Rhode Island. I mean, that's kind of an extreme analogy, but you get the idea.
Listen, I'm all for what are called breakaway republics. So just as when Kosovo broke away from Serbia, where the US was bombing Serbia, you may recall, when Kosovo was a breakaway Serbian republic, and it worked. I'm all for this whenever it happens, because most of the so-called countries in the world are really just domestic empires where many different peoples with different languages, different cultures, different religions, different ethnicities are all put under one political roof. And that never works out because one group will always try to dominate the others and it turns into chaos. So personally, I think that Taiwan should stay separate from China.
But why should the U.S. necessarily support one side over the other?
The U.S. shouldn't. It's none of our business. We absolutely don't have any idea what's going on. And it can only turn what should be nothing but a border war into a world war. In other words, this dust up between Russia and Ukraine is basically just one other border war between two, pardon the expression, shithole countries that we have no interest in. They're on the other side of the world. And the same thing with Taiwan and China, although they don't fit that description. It's none of the U.S.'s business. The U.S., the U.S. 7th Fleet floating around there. First of all, it's a sitting duck. Should the Chinese want to sink it, there's nothing we could do to stop it, quite frankly. And it serves no useful purpose. It's just provocative. And meanwhile, the U.S. spending all this money on the military is aiding the bankruptcy of American society. It's completely non-productive and, frankly, unnecessary spending, in my opinion.
All right, so you talked about what they should, or in this case, shouldn't do, what Washington shouldn't do. But going back to your point about China, we'll close it off there on geopolitics. Going back to your point about China just having to wait before something happens and they take back Taiwan, either by force or maybe the Taiwanese join willingly, who knows? When that day happens, if that day happens, what will likely be the U.S. response?
Well, look, we're dealing in the realm of abnormal psychology at this point. So what will the people in Washington, D.C. that control the U.S. and how it reacts, what will they do? I mean, it's not a question of democracy where, 300 million Americans vote on whether we should counterattack China or not. They'd vote against it, I think. But it's a question of what a few score people in Washington decide to do. And these are not our best and brightest. These are the poorest and worst kind of people that get into positions of political power. They're people that like to control and manipulate other people. They're narcissists and megalomaniacs, quite frankly. I mean, our leaders are really not much better than the Russians' leaders when you get right down to it. The same psychological profiles, Democrats or Republicans, same thing. Anyway, what's going to happen? I don't know, because as I said, you're trying to predict what abnormal psychologies are going to do. But I will say this, it's that, as Randolph Bourne said 100 years ago, war is the health of the state. And when the going gets tough domestically in an economy, what they like to do is wag the dog and distract people with a foreign enemy. So, yeah, if China does something serious in Taiwan, I don't think they will. But if they do, then, yeah, the Americans will probably have some kind of a response and it can spin out of control.
Okay, let's talk about.
I can't make a prediction.
I mean, that is a dire scenario I've outlined for you. So you're right. I mean, who knows what could happen? Bring it back to commodities and the investing space. You mentioned you do like the commodities right now. You're long gold. I have for a long time. Right.
Yes. So I've been very long gold, but I've been long gold since 1971. Mm-hmm. Frankly, when I bought my first gold coin, and I still have it. And it's been a pretty good run from $35 to $2,000. I mean, it's not as good as having bought Berkshire Hathaway and holding on, but it's been okay as a way to save, which is the way I see gold.
You've lived through several decades of tumultuous times. What typically performs well during periods of heightened geopolitical tensions or even just armed conflict in general?
People like to have things that they can trust, they can hold in their own sweaty palms when the going gets tough. You can't trust the dollar. Its fate is basically sealed. It's well on its way to being inflated out of existence. You can't trust the banks. The whole society is greatly over-financialized. So I think there's going to be, I think gold and silver are going a lot higher. I'll say that with the proviso, though, that in terms of purchasing power, gold is reasonably priced relative to what you pay for a meal or a house or a suit. Well, most people don't wear suits anymore. But gold is reasonably priced. It's a speculation, not terribly interested in it, but I don't view gold as a speculation. I view it as a savings vehicle.
When you say something is reasonably priced, you're probably assigning a fair value to it. Relatively speaking, to the fair value is reasonably priced. So what is that fair value for you?
Well, look, most commodities, everything tends to revert to the mean. So what is the mean for commodities? It's generally production costs. In other words, the price of soybeans generally rotates around plus or minus, depending on a lot of factors, what it costs to produce a bushel of soybeans. A pound of copper revolves around the price that it costs to produce it. Gold is a special situation because its primary use is not industrial, it's as money, okay? And the all-in sustaining cost of mines in the world to produce an ounce of gold today, on average, some are much less, some are much more, is about, and all-in sustaining costs, of course, is different than cash costs of mining. Very different things in today's world. But it's about $1,000 an ounce, but gold's at $2,000. So gold mining companies are the ones that are producing, are actually minting money. And from gold mining companies are, which have been, they're the most volatile securities on the face of the planet. They're more volatile than internet stocks were, quite frankly. Right now, in terms of real value, how much money they're making, gold mining stocks are the cheapest securities on earth. And that's where I am, quite frankly. Not as cheap as, look, here's a little bit of history that most people will be completely unfamiliar with and will be shocked to hear. Back in 1976, you could buy South African gold mining stocks. They've all gone out of existence. They've been merged and so forth. But there were several stocks that I bought a lot of. Rootfly, Bracken, Leslie. These stocks were yielding, believe it or not, 50 or 60% in current dividends. And then that was in 1976 when gold was $100 an ounce. And then when gold ran to 800, I was getting several times what I paid for them every year in dividends alone. Could we see a repeat at this point? That's how cheap these things can get. Maybe it's, yeah, so gold stocks are the place to be. Also uranium stocks, I've got to say, because oil, especially with these problems with Russia, with oil and natural gas, and Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, it can be real chaos. So I think all the commodities have reached a new equilibrium level, a new and higher equilibrium level. And for oil, I'm guessing that it's going to be someplace in the $90 area. And, if real chaos breaks out in the world, sure, gold could run to 2,500, 3,000, no problem. At some point, I think gold is actually going to be reinstituted as money because nobody trusts the dollar. And frankly, nobody really trusts the yuan. And why should you trust the paper currency of any government? Because we find they can be locked down, they can be frozen, your accounts. So yeah, you want gold and silver in your own possession. Sounds primitive, but it's smart.